General Leslie, welcome. I'm sure that General Leslie is well known to all of us, so I'm not going to go into great detail in his biography. Having said that, I'm going to highlight some of the things that are salient for our discussion tonight. General Leslie commanded at unit formation and divisional level before being appointed Chief of Land Staff, which is a position now known as Commander Canadian Army, in 2006. After 4 years, he was appointed as Chief of Transformation in 2010, and then retired in 2011 after 35 years of service. General Leslie was named the co-chair of the Liberal International Affairs Council of Advisors, providing the benefit of his insights to the then Liberal leader, Justin Trudeau. In 2015, he was elected to the House of Commons as the Member of Parliament for his riding of Orléans, serving as Chief Government Whip and as a member of the Queen's Privy Council of Canada. He retired from politics in 2019 and has since been living with his spouse in Ottawa. And I have no doubt that somewhere in that house, there is a portrait stashed away from prying eyes, slowly aging. It's our privilege to have someone as experienced and qualified as General Leslie to speak to us tonight, and I'm sure you'll find his insights valuable. Without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Lieutenant General, the Honourable Andrew Leslie, PC, CMM, MSc, MSM, CD. Sir? Yep, you're good.
All right. By golly, my hair does look silver. Thank you for that very kind introduction. The intent of my talk, at least my intent, is to get you all slightly irritated. I know I'm speaking to an audience which is very receptive and has a deep understanding of Canada's place in the world. But what I'm going to try and do is gallop through some reminders of where we've come from, what it was, and what it is, and link that to the emerging age of dictators, not the aging age of dictators, but the emerging age of dictators, which, quite frankly, though people may be trying to deny it, is with us for some time to come. So where have we been? World War I and World War II, population of either 10 or 13 million. Canada fielded an armed force of over 1 million people in each of those great struggles. Catastrophic price that we paid to support our friends and allies against evil. After both the First World War and the Second World War, there was a retranchement, there was peace in our time approach, and not only ourselves, but a great many of our friends and allies disarmed. And that, of course, led to a fertile breeding ground for the next round of what has come out. Before I go any further, it's important to remember that Canada was not only at the forefront of military endeavors, literally globally, amongst the top 5 or 6, but our diplomatic corps was superb and had deep roots into the military and a great knowledge of the art of diplomacy. And we were at the cutting edge of new technologies and innovation and development of expanded crop and use of land, and the list goes on and on and on. As well, thanks in part to Canada's participation, we contributed to the whole idea of it's better to be a part of a group when it comes to deterrence, so you can burden share. And burden share means just that, you share the burden proportionally. Of course, 3 great examples when Canada helped get hugely complicated structures vis-a-vis peacemaking, peacekeeping, or alliance structures in defense in North America. We got them off the ground. The United Nations in October 1945, where one of my grandfathers was a Canadian representative. The formation of the NATO itself in April 1949, where my other grandfather was represented as the Army commander. And then, of course, the establishment of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, in May 1958. In Korea, we participated. We had 27,000 Canadians who fought there. My father, one of them, as he fought in the Second World War as well. And we helped shape the emerging future in terms of participating in United Nations peacekeeping missions whose root was much akin to that of the United Nations. It was to prevent essentially the terrible outbreak of the Second World War or the use of nuclear weapons between the superpowers. So Canada was an interpositional force and of great value, along with other friends and allies of similar size and capability. And there weren't many, by the way, because we were in a class of our own for a while, and that's a good thing. And we sent at times 11, 12, 15,000 peacekeepers at any one time were deployed, not always, but consistently between the 1970s, actually the 1965s until around the 1985s. That was with an armed forces of about 60,000 people and a budget that was far, far less than that which we find today. This proud and hard-earned military legacy was earned the hard way, and Canada had a respected voice in being able to moderate some of the worst impulses of our friends, our potential enemies, and actually Canadians were in demand. Where are we now? Well, let's not forget the decade of darkness, so aptly coined by a colleague and actually a boss of mine at one time, Rick Hillier, who's still very much at it, to describe what the armed forces were going through in the turn of the century and immediately prior to that. That in turn was given sort of an energy boost based on the realization that we had to do more to help our closest friend and ally when they were attacked on the collapse of the Twin Towers. And that was a wake-up call for all of us. The fury of the American response, quite rightly, they wanted their friends to help them, and they wanted the help to be immediate. Prime Minister today, Jean Chrétien, wisely decided not to go into Iraq because that was the original American request. He didn't actually believe the story of weapons of mass destruction, and he chose instead to send Canada to Afghanistan. At the time, we were not terribly well equipped, but there had been a recent shot of energy over the previous 4, 5, 6 years where we started to get more serious about combined arms training in the Army. I was a brigade commander immediately prior to that, and we did combat team, battle group, and brigade group live fire in Suffield and Wainwright. And I had the opportunity and the privilege, the honor, to be the first general officer to deploy to Afghanistan with 3,000 of my closest friends. We did a pretty good job. Advanced peacekeeping in Kabul. And essentially, we were being targeted to build on the good work of the original Canadian contribution to Afghanistan, which was the 3rd Battalion of the PPCLI, which you know well. Our job was mainly advanced peacekeeping, some danger. We lost a couple of really good soldiers, tragically. But the hard fighting was to come. And that's the first time, really, I think, on the consciousness of most Western civilizations, or contemporary Western civilizations, that there was a growing realization that warlords, the fanatical leaders of these ever-expanding groups of people who disagree with our way of living and, quite frankly, want to kill us, was something that was probably not going to go away. And the hand of history had started to sweep back around over the curve and really now into the age equivalent to the age of barbarism, at least barbaric tactics being used by our foes. And we have a lot more than we thought we did, as we found out, because despite hard fighting later on in Kandahar, and over 45,000 Canadians cycled through Kandahar, or Afghanistan writ large in that 10-year period, earned international acclaim from hard-bitten professional soldiers and our friends and allies, specifically the Americans, the Brits, the Germans, the French, and I could go on, for the way that they were not only fighting, but the way they dealt with training or being voices of reason in varied councils, how they got on with most of the locals and could see a solution, and how, given a roll of gun tape, a Canadian soldier can fix just about anything. They were also impressed because, much akin to what happened immediately prior to the outbreak of the First World War, and the outbreak of the Second World War, and the outbreak of the Korean War, Canada started from a very low base in terms of its operational output. with equipment. And very, very rapidly, and I bear witness to this because I was either a brigade commander, a division commander, or the army commander, or a deployed task force commander for 3 prime ministers. Prime Minister Chrétien, who was not necessarily an initial early friend of the Canadian forces, essentially doubled the resources that we thought we were going to use in Afghanistan. It was then followed by Prime Minister Martin, who was no friend of ours when he was the finance minister, but times had changed. He understood the need, and he doubled what Chrétien gave us. And then Mr. Harper came in as prime minister, and he doubled what Martin gave us. And that's how we ended up with a fleet of new tanks within a matter of months, literally being flown from Germany on our newly acquired C-17 aircraft, bought in a couple of months, delivered to Kandahar, and the young men and women would get to know their tanks on the way out to the forward operating bases, and a couple of days later, they're in combat. New guns, new armored vehicles, new mine protective systems, new heavy helicopters on a handshake between myself and Peter Schumacher, the commander of the US Army. We paid for it later, of course, after a lease arrangement had run dry. New target acquisition systems, new sound ranging, drones, and I could go on for quite a while. The point being is that through all of this, so where we've been and where we are, all of this was based on politicians in Canada realizing that actually there was a need, there was a value in defense capability. But always, in times gone by, they could spend the energy and the effort, the political capital, as well as the financial, re-equip their troops, sort it out, and then go back to sleep. But what has changed, more so than anything else, is first of all, the consequences of getting it wrong. We now have far too many nations with access to nuclear weapons. And for the first time in our history, we have a state that possesses a large number of nuclear weapons. One is enough. But Russia has over 7,200 of them at last count. And by the way, a scary thing is we're not sure if their count is accurate. That has been invaded by a non-nuclear state. What am I talking about? I'm talking about Russia's attack into Ukraine again. Their third, of course, first you know about, second was 2014, third was 2022. But now recently, Ukraine has invaded Kursk. Now, let's not forget that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 2014 under a guarantee signed by Russia, China, United States, Great Britain, and I believe Turkey and France. And weeks after they gave up their last nuclear weapon, Russia invaded them in huge numbers. In between all this, we had the precipitous withdrawal of Canadian troops from Afghanistan in around 2012, where, quite frankly, our government, and I believe the people of Canada, didn't understand the power and the utility of force in staying with a friend and ally so that they don't collapse when times get bad, which left the United States fighting alone. And President Biden inherited former President Trump's withdrawal plan, and he decided to stick with it because he, according to his reading of the tea leaves, Americans were getting tired of the forever wars, Iraq and Afghanistan specifically. The precipitous and disgraceful withdrawal from Afghanistan was a cue that attracted the attention of predators. And those two predators were arguably the two most dangerous men in the world right now. One was Putin, and the other was President of China, President Xi. Putin saw that as an immediate signal that the United States did not have the backbone to stick by its friends and allies when times got tough, and that they were obviously tired of war and tired of the investments required to assure deterrence. And a short while after that, he attacked. He attacked through a gradual buildup of force, which eventually peaked at 350,000, and in he went to poor Ukraine. Now, the good news is we're all aware of it. I believe President Biden has redeemed himself because the way he orchestrated the support to Ukraine, at least in the initial year and two, was quite masterful, and he kept the coalition not only together, but starting to pay more and more attention because they realized, they being the rest of NATO, that they could be next. President Xi saw the same signals. In this case, he believed that it was time for him to move on Taiwan. And he's been sending sort of saber rattles of communiques and posturing with dozens and dozens of Chinese aircraft filing Taiwanese space, or probably down to the case now 3 to 4 times a year, for now in its 3rd year, of multiple blockade training exercises to make the point to Taiwan that they can be choked to death by China by cutting off their supply from the sea. All because of the perception of weakness, and all because we are now increasingly seeing nations across the globe being run not through democratic principle and not with the idea of change is good, but with the reemergence of the age of dictators. As I speak to you now tonight, BRICS has assembled, which is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America. Now there's many more. There's 31 national representatives at Putin's hosted venue inside Russia. And they are discussing ways they can collaborate, they can support one another, and underlying all of this is their desire to see alternatives to the US dollar being used as the benchmark for most international goods and payment, specifically energy, specifically oil. Every single one of those representatives has displayed dictatorial tendencies, even though they may still be democratically elected. Over 3/4 of them have been in power for more than 15 years, and some of them for as long as 28. And between them, surprisingly enough, they now control more than half the world's population and over half of its GDP. And they're starting to realize their power. Dictators are usually lonely figures, and they tend to prey on the weaker ones around them, A, because they can't tolerate strength as a challenge to their authority, and B, if they're contiguous territories, it's always good to have a slowly expanding war with which to unify your population behind your dictatorial leadership ambitions, because danger over there, or up there, or down there, you must support your leader in time of war. As well, when you're fighting a war, it's a lot easier and it's a lot more opaque in terms of the demonstrations of raw power to keep your citizens in line. Interestingly enough, despite Russia's staggering losses, 660,000 casualties since 2022. And of those casualties, a staggering 35 to 40% are killed. When we were fighting in Afghanistan, very different, but it was still intense. Our killed to combat ratio was somewhere close to 30 to 1. What that means is the generals and their dictator don't give a damn about the lives of their Russian troops, as we all know, as has been their history. But here we are now in 2024, and that same casualty ratios we saw during the Second World War and the First World War with Russian soldiers has not stopped them. Dictators have nowhere to go. If you resign as a dictator, you usually don't last long. And the only way you get rid of a dictator is usually through the excessive application of violence right between their beady eyes. So they tend to surround themselves with raw power, and now they're using it. And they're using it even and especially if they're nuclear nations. And they don't appear to be deterred by NATO's nuclear deterrent structure. So let me complete the circle and then I'll open up for questions. NATO was set up as a first strike nuclear response organization. It had at its heart the threat of nuclear weapons. If you cross the inter-German border, we will nuke you. Canada actually had nuclear land-based missiles in Germany at that time. That is gone. Why? Because over the years, it became clear that you had to have some sort of middle ground because people, quite frankly, your enemies, didn't believe us that we would risk global destruction to protect Kyiv or to protect Brussels. Now we might, but it was no longer a sure thing, which is why you had this buildup of conventional forces during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, to which Canada was relatively immune, because we, of course, live in a fireproof south, far from the flammable substances, a quote by a guy called Danduran, which has gone down in infamy as being completely wrong. Those dictators now have a variety of tools in their toolbox, and they have to keep going, they have to keep expanding. And if countries are isolated or not contributing fair shares to coalitions, if countries are singled out for having not a capable defense force, usually it doesn't matter because we have other friends and allies who can pick up the slack, so to speak. And of course, most Canadians know deep down the Americans will always, always, always defend us. To use a favorite expression of my father's, oops. One of the two candidates for the next presidency of the United States has made it clear, that those nations which don't meet 2% GDP of spend on defense, he could care less what Russia does to them. Now you can make the argument he said that didn't really mean it. Beware. There's a variety of people out there who, when they say things 15 or 20 times, we should start to pay attention. Putin has written about, described in some detail, and articulated his desire to attack Ukraine and reincorporate it into the Russian structure. He's said the same thing about Poland, about portions of Germany, about the Baltic states, so many times that we better pay attention. And we're not. Now, since 2015, when I first got elected, I was under the aspiration that we would be allocating a whole bunch of resources to Canadian forces based on a relatively good plan, which obviously I was around for. 2017 came out as strong, secure, engaged. Not one single spending objective in that plan that was outlined in 2017 has been realized. Since 2015, not a single new advanced combat capability has been acquired by Canada. Since 2015, our armed forces are down 16,000 people out of an already modest strength of about 100,000 regular and reserve. Since 2015, we have contributed less than 25 military personnel to UN peacekeeping, of which we were part of the founding nations. 25 per year. 70% of our Army's fleet can't move. Half of our ships don't have the spare parts or the sailors to operate them. And half of our aircraft are not flyable. At a time when dictators are our neighbors, our pristine Arctic is currently undefended. We have no permanently stationed combat capability or defense or surveillance assets in the north. Thankfully, the Americans are close by with 22,000 fully trained, thoroughly equipped, full spectrum armed forces in Alaska. But our armed forces has less than 300 members in the Arctic, which is an area far bigger than the entirety of Europe. Russia and China do not recognize our claims to vast portions of the seafloor, and their exploration vessels are already present. We're in trouble. You're in trouble. And it's coming fast. So on that cheerful note, I will take your questions.
Okay, sir, thanks very much for that. As you said, your intent was to rile us up, so I think you probably have. First question here is about, it's from Philip Fisher. So Philip, if you can unmute yourself and just work that one. This is about, I think, Afghanistan and the decision to use the regular army rather than mobilizing. So Philip, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Yes, General Leslie, what was it that made you decide to fight a war using the regular army? Canada has never used its regular army. They have recruited, whether they went to the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, they always recruited a special service force. We might have used a regular battalion to begin in Afghanistan, but they wore out. And you yourself said the army is worn out. Why did you not utilize? At this point in time, we are totally defenseless. We don't have the reserves that we had in 1939 when we had at least $500,000 men who were veterans and who could form the nucleus of a new army. Today, we have a few reserve people that went over there, but some of them went 2 or 3 or 4 times. That's not 2 or 3 soldiers. That's one person 2 or 3 or 4 times. If we had used the reserves properly, we might have had 10 battalions that had some experience and some knowledge of what a military looks like. Today, we have nobody. We have nobody.
Okay.
Other than this crowd that we have here tonight.
Okay, so let me try and answer that question. First of all, 46,600 Canadians fought in Afghanistan.
I don't believe that number. I don't think that we had more than about 18 or 19,000 because we don't have that many in the whole damn forces, reserves and regulars put together. If somebody goes 3 or 4 times and fills a seat on an airplane 3 or 4 times, that doesn't make 3 or 4 individuals. That's the same person 3 or 4 times. So your 40 or 45,000, I think, is a way overstated.
Okay, it's good to have a difference of opinion. I think my opinion is based on the facts that I was aware of when I was the Army commander. So that's the first point. Of that, 15,000 were reserves. Some of them did more than 2 or 3 tours, you're right, but that number is quite small. The rules to go to Afghanistan were, you go the first time, that's on you. If you want to go the second time, you have to get the authority of your brigade commander or higher. If you want to go a third time, you have to get my approval. We did have a significant number, you're right, who went several times, but we only had enough equipment to equip essentially an organization that could train the forces, which was one, usually a brigade group. And we only had enough equipment to actually get the stuff in the hands of the soldiers in Kandahar for the same sized organization. So it wasn't a question of having a bottleneck necessarily of willingness of young Canadians who wanted to go to Afghanistan, because the numbers were so large that we actually had to make it competitive. It was the equipment that we were lacking. And unfortunately, all 3 prime ministers, of whom I've said nice words quite recently, but we never got enough funding to equip the rest of the army or the reserves. Not at all. And as soon as the Afghan war was over, they ratcheted back the spending such that we couldn't continue that energy and enthusiasm to join the armed forces by opening up vacancies in either the regular force battalions or our reserve units. During the deployment to Afghanistan, the regular force, the size of the regular force battle group essentially that we had close to 1,000 infantry in it, which is actually a wartime strength. Of that 1,000, close to 200 would be reservists. So we couldn't have done it without the reserves. Here we are today. The tragedy of all that we did in Afghanistan was, of course, displayed on national and international TV by the precipitous withdrawal. But what we're facing now is a lot more dangerous than what Canada and our friends and allies faced, essentially, when the Twin Towers went down. And we are even less prepared today than we were immediately prior to deployment, which was in 2003. We have less equipment. And in terms of peer comparison with potential enemies, it's even older. And our institutions are hollowed out, and we're still missing 16,000 people from our ranks. By the way, that's not a function. So let me make a statement, full stop. The quality of the young men and women who are joining our ranks these days is just as good as that which I saw in 2003. Who are, by the way, just as good as those who volunteered to go to Korea, according to the veterans that I was speaking to, who are just as good as the ones that showed up for the First World War and the Second War. But do you know that over 70,000 applied over the last 2 years, of which they took in less than 10? And of that 10, a whole bunch got returned to unit or not allowed to join for a whole host of reasons. Where was the acceptance of a certain amount of risk? Where was getting expedited processing? Where the hell's that gone to? When I joined the reserves, I showed up on a Monday. By Friday, I had coveralls, and I waited about a year to get my security clearance, about another year to get my medical, but I was out learning my trade. Where's that thinking gone? So I've built on your question. I sense your frustration. I'm glad to see I got you riled up. And by the way, the team introduced me and they said that, you know, I was blah, 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 and this government and that government. I just wanted to get it out on the table. I'm no longer a liberal, just so you know.
Good for you. Yeah, right now we are in trouble.
We're in big trouble.
The Chinese could park 2 brigades of infantry on some island up north with a red flag and say, this is ours. And we could wave at them and say, no, it isn't, it's ours. Please go away. And they would just thumb their noses at us. We don't have any ability to defend what we own. And they have probably bought every chart from the Geological Survey of Canada in Ottawa, so they know which islands they might want to take over very quickly. But we have nothing, no way to do it. And I don't know how we wake them up that this is real. This is not play. This is not pretend. And
that's right.
If we were to call the Americans, especially if Mr. Trump was the president, he would say, yeah, we'll come and defend you. But all of the water that goes north in the Mackenzie River is now going to be coming down in a 25-foot culvert to California and Arizona. And thank you very much. Don't worry about where your water goes, Canadians. You're paying the price.
Well, I actually met Mr. Trump when I went to the White House with the current prime minister. And I won't tell you what was discussed there because that's breaking cabinet confidence, but I can assure you that Mr. Trump is very, very, very transactional. Yeah, if he gives you something or lends you something, then he's going to want something back right away.
Yeah.
The interesting news is the Republicans and Democrats both appear to be united in their condemnation of Canada. And as you may know, they recently signed a joint letter, which is amazing, that
yes.
they signed something saying, hey, Canada, get on with the program here.
Yeah.
And they're growing tired of defending us at a time when we're about to renegotiate NAFTA as well. So there's danger signals all over the place.
Yeah.
But look at us. We're a nation of 41 million now. Our population has increased by close to 10 million since 2015. We're a $2.2 trillion economy.
Yeah.
And yet we can't spend more than $25 billion a year in defense. Aha, people will say, look, the budget for defense has increased by 50% since 2015. Yep, sure, fine. But the defense inflation factor, in other words, the number that's applied to cater, yeah, it's gone up 7% per average per year.
Yeah.
Over 10 years, that's a 70% drop. And that's not even with compound interest, which I'm not smart enough to figure that out. Point being is your dollar buys you a lot less, we're spending less, and we've got more of a threat looming on our horizon, and we have really interesting politics down south that doesn't bode well for the, hey, we want a free ride. And not enough people are paying attention. So
No,
thank you for your passion.
They're not. We need
We'll have a beer
probably-
next time I'm out your way.
Sir, there's two kind of questions coming up. One from Harold Scarab and one from Stuart Campbell, and they both relate to what you touched on, which is political will. So Harold, I'll let you ask your question first, and then Stuart, you can jump in afterwards. Thanks.
Hello again, sir. Long time since Afghanistan.
Hoorah.
We see the problem, you know, as a former int guy kind of, I'm always interested in what is the solution. First of all, you have to figure out what is the threat. It's extremely obvious what the threats are. We know what the problem is. We have some ideas to how to fix it. Why is it that we can't convince the people governing us to act on some of the recommendations and do something before it becomes a crisis we can't handle?
I believe, a personal opinion, but after studying them at relatively close range, they believe themselves to be very competent in a variety of domains. Historians will argue whether or not that's true or not. But they're surrounding them is this smug arrogance and knowledge in their soul that the Americans will defend us. And they don't and have never understood, any of them, quite frankly, the utility of defense. In other words, defense is not something you can just use and then throw away and then try to recreate when you think you need it. Defense is something which is essentially at the top of the pyramid of responsibilities of the federal government. The current gang are very interested in dabbling in child support, in daycare, in lunch for kids, in pharmacare, in how medicine is administered. By the way, none of those issues are federal responsibility. They're dabbling in the Fed stuff, and the stuff they're supposed to do, they don't pay a lot of attention to. And now, wham, their worst fear and expectations have been realized, and they're being called out by just about the entirety of NATO, and more importantly, our big friend and neighbor down south, because we're not ready for the challenges that are right there. How does this change? Where's the political will? I think the current team is past redemption. I really do. I don't think there's anything they can say or do that will allow them to change course. They don't know how to fix things. And I'm pretty confident that an election will be held in 2025, if not before. And I'd be very interested to see if we can all make defense an election issue.
Thank you, sir.
What green or blue or red, doesn't matter. You got to say, hey, this is a concern to me and it should be a concern to all of us, because politicians respond to that sort of pressure. And these current team is so busy doing whatever they're doing. There's nothing, don't expect anything from them.
If I can use an analogy, a bunch of people in a place called Israel went off to a rock concert. Probably one of the most astute armies in the world thought, it's all right.
Yeah.
And a bunch of guys in hang gliders came over and murdered a massive number of them. Surprise! Because they let their guard down. They didn't think it could happen. And these are people who are experienced in the world of evil and war. What do we do if it happens to us? I think 911 is the closest we've come so far. It's entirely possible it can happen again. But we need to somehow wake up the people who make the decisions on what happens to our defense force. And I'm not sure that that could be done in our present climate. Thank you again, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Nice picture, nice backdrop. Really good.
They're all people you and I work with, sir.
Is that the ASIC right there?
No, that is General Lacroix's group.
Okay, great. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well done.
Good.
I met the two of you at the same time.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Harold. Stuart, does that answer your concern, or do you want to build on General Leslie's comments?
I think Harold covered quite a bit of it, but to build a little bit more on that, I served 20 years. I got out 25 years ago, and same thing, budget cuts. We saw it all back when I served. But building on what Harold was saying is we know the problem statement. We've always known it. You've articulated it very well. What's the solution? I think we all know what the solution is. What's the reality check or confidence level in actually achieving that solution, what we know it should be? That's question one. Question two, do you think the new Chief of Defense Staff has the chutzpah to stand up to the current PM or the future PM to convince them? Because I don't think the average Joe on the road, out in the field here, is going to sway political opinion to do that. So that was the second question. Three, short-term or long-term, should we reestablish another foothold in Europe again, i.e. Baden-Württemberg, Germany, whatever the case may be? Because if we think we were isolated then, we are super isolated now. And with Trump comes into power, you're kind of fucked.
Okay, eloquent. To answer your first question, I believe that even the most stupid of politicians can eventually realize that they're facing an existential threat. Now, a lot of politicians, in my relatively limited experience, one kick at it, and then I left because I just couldn't make a difference. Most join for the right reasons. The power-hungry few justify their reasons as being right, but they're more interested in acquiring and retaining power. The ones who end up as decision makers more often than not are the most expert at the political skill, and they all respond to public pressure. So let me now leapfrog into the second question. Does the current CDS have that which it takes to convince the Prime Minister and Cabinet to allocate more resources to defense? You know that by law, fearless advice in private, loyal execution in public. And it's not necessarily the purview of the CDS to go outside and to criticize government to Canadians. Is she doing all that she can to get this government moving, to spend money that's required now for equipment that should have been bought 5, 10 years ago? Yes, I believe she is. But does she have enough people who are doing the political thing? Because she doesn't do that. Right? You can have CDSs that skirt close to the edges, but you cannot have a CDS who will take on a government. Because that's not, you don't want that, because that's how you end up with dictators, quite frankly. That's how, just look at Africa. Well, I think they now have 11 dictators, 9 of whom are, I think it's 9, are with Putin now, which is quite alarming. So that's where you come in. Your voice, if it's silent, doesn't count. And if there's enough voices out there who just articulate the frustration at Canada being essentially defenseless, and our great men and women who choose to defend us don't have the tools they need to give them a fighting chance of survival. Oh, and by the way, a war is coming unless we can deter it, and we're not doing anything for deterrence right now. That's a really simple message. And the more people we can get talking about it, the more the politicians will actually start to pay attention. Like I say, it doesn't matter what color your MP is in your riding, green, blue, red. If they hear your voice and that of your friends and neighbors, then let's make this let's make this an election issue. So the candidates vying to become Prime Minister can be asked on that stage, when Canadians will do most of their judgment as to who gets the nod, what are you going to do to shore up the current many shortfalls in the Canadian forces and reestablish Canada as a nation that can carry its own water in terms of contributing to the defense of friends and allies? Because right now we're in trouble. Did I answer them? I think I did. Yeah.
Just the latter one. Do you think at some point in the near future, do we need another foothold?
Oh, yes, right. I'm so sorry. Well, yes, I would say we definitely need a foothold in Europe, but we also have to expand our forces to do more than just Europe. We have to expand our forces because we've got the Indo-Pacific as well, where now most of our trade is either going to go or it's already there. And we have to contribute globally. We can't just do, 15 to 20,000 troops in Europe, which we used to have, but essentially nothing anywhere else. Which isn't quite true because we always had a couple thousand out on peacekeeping, which we only have 25 now. We've got about 1,500 currently in Latvia, and that's growing. And I think that will be a base for a while. But let's go back to our dictators, plural. And the most dangerous of the two is probably Xi, but in the short term, it's Putin. And so you look at Putin's writings and his inflammatory speeches over the last 24 years. He's been talking about going after Ukraine and where else? Number one on his list is the Baltic states. And of them, which is the most probable? Latvia. Because Latvia has got about 35% Russian speaking. And so part of his grand vision is to reunite the Russian speaking peoples. Mm-hmm. And where's Canada right now? Latvia. So we better make sure those troops have a fighting chance.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the next question from Daniel Galen, and it builds on what Stuart just talked about with moving back to Europe. So Daniel, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
So General, thank you very much. Just a little bit of my background. I served 38 years in the military. I served a tour and I served with NORAD, what is in Canada, but I also served with NATO for 4 years in Belgium. And then my last tour was actually defense attaché in Poland, including the Baltic states. So I'm very well aware. That was during the time that Russia took Crimea, actually. So it was an interesting time to be there. Yeah. And I work with a lot of Americans, of course, throughout my career, like most of us, I believe. We kind of take our alliance with the U.S. for granted, and I think the general public overall take our defense with the United States as granted. But I think with more isolationist tendency from the U.S., not just from one party, but really both parties, and they look after themselves first. Do you think there's more of a future for us working more closely with Europe? And in fact, as Stuart said, maybe more of a foothold in Europe. And I know we currently have troops in Latvia, but certainly in Poland and the rest of Western Europe and more in NATO, get more involved in NATO and things like that. Do you think there's potential there?
I do. And let me give you an example which would really irritate the current Prime Minister of Canada. There was a guy called Pierre Trudeau who had very strongly held views, very, very intelligent, very articulate, a charming fellow. And he articulated a vision for Canada, which saw a whole bunch of resources being thrown at social development. And when he went and informed his friends and allies, specifically United States, Germany, and England, he was surprised at the reaction it generated, to the extent where the leader of Germany said, if you don't order a whole bunch of German tanks, we're going to reduce our trade. And the leader of the United Kingdom said, if you don't order a whole bunch of stuff, we're going to cut this, that, and the other. And the Americans said, are you out of your mind? And he then engaged on what can best be called a shopping spree, and bought CF-18s, the modern frigates, or now they're the old frigates. At the time they were modern. A whole host of self-propelled guns, and the list goes on. Flash forward to today. Those same conversations are being had, I'm pretty sure. Mm-hmm. They'll be had even more so after the 5th of November down in the States. Doesn't matter which side wins on this issue, because the American policymakers are united in their irritation and anger with Canada for being, quote, a laggard on defense, unquote. I see a lot of harsh words coming. starting, well, it's already started, and that'll grow in intensity. We are now being criticized by friends, allies, and even non-members at the political level. And more of that is required because this current leadership team only responds to pressure. So not necessarily the national good. And right now they're desperate to get reelected. And that's all they really care about. So that's in part why we should do all that we can, not necessarily try and influence them, but influence anybody who seeks elected office federally to remember that defense is a really important issue. And if you cannot leave the provinces alone to take care of feeding kids, which is important, but feeding kids at lunchtime is not what the Prime Minister of Canada should be focusing his attention on.
Right.
Is it important? Yeah, absolutely. Now, more to Europe. Yes, I can see that. Especially if Latvia becomes a frontline state. If tragically Ukraine doesn't survive, as the Ukraine that we know and love today, and despite brilliant soldier, an amazing passion for defending their families who are literally, in the village behind them. The Americans are bleeding, the Russians are bleeding them. And though the exchange ratio is very favorable to Ukraine, probably close to 6, 7, 8 to 1, Ukraine can't afford the losses, whereas Russia doesn't care. So I can see a scenario where Latvia becomes a frontline state, and probably we would deploy someone somewhere a bit further back in terms of support centers, but our frontline troops would definitely increase in number. It might well be Latvia, or it might be another risk point. Latvia, of course, you were there. You know it far better than I. If you look at its geography, to those who haven't lived there like you have, it's kind of isolated. It's not hard to sort of cut it off and surround it. Wouldn't take a lot. It doesn't matter.
Especially with Kaliningrad right there, right? So
absolutely, which is a huge Russian installation, and they've got a lot of troops there, which you can see actually from the Latvian border. You can just literally look right across the border and see them all lined up. But we have to remember that no matter what happens next, Canada, we can't view this as, well, we're only going to do it for, like Afghanistan, where we're just not going to equip 1 or 2 battle groups. We've got to do everybody. And it's not a question of having a reg reserve, because that's the only, because we're capped on numbers. It's that type of thinking is going to have to disappear. Mm-hmm. And it can, because we're a wealthy nation. Look, the government could find $10 billion 3 times for those EV plants. Remember those? The federal government, and they found the money within weeks, and they announced it within months. So that's $30 billion on EV plants to create a couple thousand jobs. Yet you can't find money or the willingness to let your own Defense Department spend the money that you promised. Since 2015, this government has returned $19 billion that they allocated to defense. So smoke with the left hand. Oops, I ran out of hands. And mirrors on the other side. So there we go. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thanks, sir.
Sorry, I'm going to ask a question on behalf of one of the members who's having computer issues, and it's about procurement. What are the bottlenecks, and how do we overcome them? And then I'm going to shift from there. Fred Moret, if you could be ready to ask your question, because yours is about supply chains. So the initial issue is, how do we overcome the bottlenecks in procurement?
A variety of politicians and public servants and generals have stood up and said, "Oh, the procurement system is awful, and it just takes so long, and and they go away, they rip the stuffing out of their teddy bear, they think about it, they retire, and nothing's changed." I have a different point of view. There's 3 things that will fix our procurement system: prime ministerial leadership, followed by prime ministerial leadership. Now, why 3 times did I say the same thing? Because I saw 3 prime ministers who were not that keen on initially supporting defense. Chrétien, who literally would pick up the phone and say, "Does that guy in Afghanistan has everything he's asked for this week?" And the answer was, yeah. What can we do to help? Followed by Martin, who had exactly the same attitude, followed by Prime Minister Harper, who took that attitude, doubled down, and would literally go on a rampage across his cabinet if stuff was late in being delivered to the troops. That's what you need. That's how you fix it. And they know that. So if they're not fixing it and they know they can, it's because they don't want to. It's as simple as that. If you get the Prime Minister involved, who looks at his cabinet and tells the Minister of Procurement and the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Public Works and the Minister of whatever the hell, this is really important. You've got 40 days to deliver main battle tanks. It's impossible. Well, ask the crews of the Leopard 2s. Ask the Chinook drivers. You didn't think you could do it until you actually got it done. So it's as simple as that. And other people will no, it's about this and some other levels of analysis and review. It's all crap. Leadership.
So we're back to political will, really.
Yeah, this is so serious now that there's no more, doing clever about buying 5 and then convincing the government that you really meant to buy 500 and waiting 6 years for a review cycle. We're in a crisis. And if we admit we have a problem, then we'll start trying to solve it. But if you just pin it all on an anonymous series of mysterious actors who quote the procurement system, it gets everybody off the hook who really doesn't want to do this, because it's hard. And a lot of these machines are not socially redeeming. Right?
Fred, do you want to jump in on this one?
Sure, absolutely. General Leslie, sir, good evening. I'll just by way of background, I served with the 8th Hussars and Strathconas in my past life. I was a Cold War soldier in the Fulda Gap back in the late 80s, early 90s.
That was called Option Otter.
And fast forward a few years, I've appreciated your leadership and your insight on these affairs. We actually spent, you may not remember, but we spent a couple hours together back in 2004 when I was managing a young political candidate in Ottawa. So fast forward to now. I work, and my team works on different Canadian Forces bases. I'm seeing some of the investments that we're doing with the arrival of the F-35s and whatnot. And I understand the procurement issues as they're being discussed, et cetera. But I don't think overall we're articulating the actual threat and the vulnerability to Canada in a way that will allow Canadians to get away from this sense that we are isolated from all these events. It's going to happen there. Over the course of the last year and a half, we've seen the Russian FSB be responsible through terrorist organizations and organized crime groups, cause attacks on defense supply chains towards Ukraine throughout Europe. We're seeing these hybrid attacks in the US on critical infrastructure, water treatment plants, those kinds of things. We're seeing swarm drones against F-22 bases in the US. So my question is, how would you assess the threat to Canada that these types of lower level attacks could come to us, say, on a 5 to 10 year horizon, especially if we end up in some sort of a hot shooting contest out of Latvia, et cetera. It doesn't even need to go nuclear, I think. Something as simple as a hypersonic missile into the port of Montreal or the port of Vancouver would severely test our resilience as a society. Just could I open that up to your comment?
Yeah. Look, military theorists would agree with you, as do I, not necessarily military theorists, but there's irrefutable evidence that Russia and China are already engaged in the initial steps of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare being not necessarily kinetic, but it doesn't exclude it. And you've seen assassination attempts on leaders of industry in Germany by Russian agents. You've seen a variety of intelligence operatives work in London, and this goes on. Canada, a sleepy, peaceable kingdom whose economy is increasingly focused on trade, to the extent that really, and of course, our biggest trading partner is the United States. Anything that which disrupts that flow, which is now multiple billions of dollars per day each way, will have an immediate impact on our quality of life. If the United States turns into a hardened fortress, and we are their biggest trading partner, and they need the stuff that we give them, where would you go after in terms of trying to disrupt the supply chain? You go where it's easiest. And guess where that is? That's here. Are we there yet? No. But are there malign state actors at work trying to steal our money, trying to confuse us, trying to promote hatred and division? Yes, yes, and yes. There's market schemes, illegal and inappropriate and immoral market schemes which affect stocks and bonds. There's weirdness happening in terms of misinformation or trying to create division. There's hate groups that are being funded by Iran. We're hard at work on the streets of Toronto and Ottawa and Vancouver, trying to agitate and create divisions and stuff that we didn't think we'd ever see on our streets, which is essentially calls for genocide in the streets of Canada against Canadians who may share a religion, but nothing else because they're Canadians. And here we are. Times are changing, not necessarily for the better. You can't ignore it though. So I fully accept what you're saying. I think that Canada is a weakly defended, weakly prepared nation. And I use that term deliberately. And it behooves us to pay more attention to what is coming. At times, I and others, we feel like, you know, oh, look out, there's a dragon right around the corner or a bear lurking in the woods, and it's just never there. Well, it's kind of hard to refute the evidence, right? So get ready. Those who don't prepare and invest in deterrence will be doomed to fight a war. And if you fight it, you better win.
Indeed. Thank you, sir.
Kate Thrasher, can I call on you next?
Thank you very much, Quentin. Sir, Kate Thrasher, Calgary, and my nephew, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Smid, retired, sadly deceased, had the great pleasure of serving as one of your aides in Afghanistan, and he spoke very, very highly of your command and your leadership. And I just want to say thank you for your many contributions to Canadians and to the Canadian Armed Forces. I think one of the things when I talk to people, they have no idea about the state of the Canadian Armed Forces. So if there's a way that we can all blast out or get some messaging out there in a way that's meaningful. They are more interested in childcare, unfortunately, and so on. So that's concerning. And people seem to care about the Canadian Armed Forces when there's a flood and they want someone to rescue them. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of chatter around the importance of it. My question to you, sir, is in terms of recruitment, are we evolving enough in the folks in charge in our messaging to attract the target market that we need in the armed forces and to have some of the flexibility that young people today are looking for? Are we evolving enough in terms of our recruitment initiatives? And you mentioned, my second question is, you mentioned all tri-services we know are in need desperately of resources. If you picked one item, what would it be?
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much. I had the honor and pleasure of serving with your son several times in my career when I was at a brigade headquarters in one brigade. Then he was with me in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I spoke to him shortly before he passed away. Smitty was a hell of a guy. And anyways, we're all very proud of him and you. And anyways, the recruiting system is, it's easy to blame the government for money. But from my point of view, the problems with the recruiting system, the armed forces owns that. Because that is not the purview of the public service. That is not the purview of politics. And yes, you've got to have enough money to pay your troops. And that gets back to a portion of the reason why we're 16,000 short. But if you have allowed your recruiting system to get so overly focused on overhead and bureaucracy that you have 70,000 people who apply and you only end up taking 10,000, and yet just about everybody who's on this call who's served in the military can tell me stories about how it took them, 6 weeks to get in, and that was too long, and it took me 10 weeks, and some people are waiting 2 to 3 years. I wrote a letter of recommendation for the son of a friend, and it took him over 2.5 years to get in, and he's like perfect. He's got everything. That story is just a drop in the bucket. So we own this issue because we've gotten the armed forces has not put the required energy and enthusiasm into sorting this out. And it gets to a point where if you got continued roadblocks, then you replace all the people and you start with a fresh crop. But the good news is the CDS said that that's her number one priority and she's going to fix it. And that's her job to do that. Air, land, and sea. And likewise, the Army commander's got to solve the Army problem, the Navy, and the Air Force. And joint is wonderful, and you might want to save money by getting them all in the same room, and forget all that. Now, time's of the essence, and they appear to be willing to join, is just don't make it hard. Has the recruiting system kept pace with contemporary technology or techniques? Almost certainly not. Why? Because once again, it's grown into monstrous size in terms of the overhead. The messaging is probably skewed. I'm reassured though, having seen a couple of the recent little 15, 20-second clips they put out, the Army troops are now doing Army things. They show main battle tanks supported by artillery going into the attack. They show people jumping out of airplanes and not necessarily to rescue somebody. They show fighters doing fighter stuff. They show ships in high seas, launching rockets. Okay, that's good. Do you remember way back when we were all really young? The Armed Forces lectures to recruit or their video clips, they had us going up and down, not us, but the actors, carrying briefcases and talking about their post-career or post-military career opportunities. Like, what? So we went through some pretty good recruiting during the Afghan war when we didn't actually have to recruit because we had more volunteers to go overseas and there were slots to fill, to now more bureaucratic nonsense, which is being sorted out. Some of the technologies and the techniques, I'm sure, look, I don't want to malign them because they're not here to defend themselves, but let's have an evidentiary qualitative framework in which to discuss the problem. The evidence is clear that it's not working. So you got to change it. And if you don't change it, you're part of the problem. That's the sort of attitude you need.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Joe, can I get you to ask your question? And then Edward Osborne, you'll be up next.
Sure, thanks for your time. Can you put on your political advisor hat? You identified a couple of key dictators, Putin and Xi Jinping. Recently, there has been an evolution of two organizations, the Quad, comprising Japan, Australia, India, and the US, and on the continent, something called PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation comprising virtually all European continental states if you were advising these organizations on how to thwart the ambitions of either Putin or Xi Jinping, are there particular necessary conditions you might tell these organizations, look, guys, here are the first things you got to do if you're going to be successful. These are not treaty organizations. They're not collective defense organizations like NATO. They're more than ad hoc alliances, but there's a convergence of national interests. But if you were to advise them, what might you say to them to at least start to be effective? Thank you.
In years gone by, the United States and their allies would essentially buy their way into hearts and minds of client states, specifically Africa, the Middle East, South America, with some success, to the extent where a variety of these nations have grown used to the handout. Part of the ensuing tragedy is very often these states in themselves produce dictators who then get dependent on the handouts. And if the Americans suddenly decide that they don't want to do the handouts anymore for a whole bunch of very good reasons, Russia and China are very quick to step in behind them and offer them the loot. And that is going on in Africa to the extent where the United States has been asked to leave by 5 or 6 dictators from countries to whom they poured a lot of time and money, a relative amount of time and money anyways, and they've been replaced quickly by the Russia or China. And the same is true elsewhere. Saudi Arabia is playing with fire in its participation in this gang in Russia right now. They're there. They, of course, are interested in their economy, and they're very keen to move away from the US dollar because that restricts their ambitions. And I think they'd much rather go to each country pays with their own revenue, which would make them an enormous amount of profits because there'd be no leveling effect by any one currency. So that's their ambition. That is supported in the main by the other dictators, leaders, i.e. Russia and China, because they themselves don't want to go through the shock of merging into a central one. So what positive message could you send, could I send, could whoever the President of the United States send to the people who may be under the process of getting seduced by the dark side? If you're not a dictator, the message would be beware, because though it may look good today, very shortly you're going to find yourself either singing to their tune or taken out and shot. And fear is a pretty good motivator. And more of the democracies are starting to realize what's going on around them with the non-democratic states. The trouble is we've waited a bit too late. Because if half the world's population and half the world's resources are part of that dictatorial hub, it's really tough. It's really tough. And when you get near peers, which one's going to back down? And all it takes is one significant miscalculation, and then you've unleashed the demon. Russia has far too many nuclear weapons. North Korea is sending soldiers to fight under Russian flag in Ukraine. What are they getting in return? Almost certainly nuclear technology. To do what to South Korea? To posture further. I mean, no one in their right mind thinks that North Korea is going to invade South Korea, but they wouldn't be beyond some mad stroke of setting off a pulse within 60 kilometers of their border, by the way, which is also South Korea's capital, to break sanction or to whatever, to distract their own population because they're starving because so much is being spent on defense. And that scenario is replicated elsewhere. So unfortunately, I don't have a terribly cheery message right now. But one thing for sure, there's dragons and bears out there, and we better get ready for them, both in deterrence and warfighting capability, because if you don't have deterrence, boy, we're really close to the bad guys. We are literally right next door.
Thank you.
Last question then I think is goes to Fraser for now. Fraser Old, again, back to procurement. And he has a specific question about what perhaps may help solve some of the procurement blockages. Fraser?
Great. Thanks for this tonight, sir. Just by way of background, I'm still serving 30 years this month. Currently the Commandant of the Army Staff College in Kingston.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so sitting in my imposed restriction apartment, listening in tonight, trying to get a bit smarter. A quick one on procurement. You know, we do have kind of what I'll call meager defense dollars to spend. We also have kind of industrial and technological benefits policy that looks to have our acquisition dollars provide spin-offs for Canadian jobs, Canadian industry, etc. This is known to kind of hinder our acquisition agility. It also can hinder our interoperability with allies and partners, which will be an important factor should there be a fight in the future. Should defense, given your experience, should defense have some kind of carve out from the industrial and technological benefits policy so that we can make our acquisition more agile, more interoperable, and so that we can get better value for dollar when we're acquiring military equipment? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. Very, very eloquently put. If you ever want me to come down and talk to your students, my fee is a beer. So defense has grown under bureaucratic pressure to have literally well over several hundred signatories in dozens and dozens of documents required before you get to a system maturation of actually signing a contract to be signed. And you've got every special interest group you could possibly conceive of who wants to have a share of the pie for legitimate reasons, because they want the goodies to go to their riding or their community or their group. And the government, because deep down, don't forget, this current government has not shown any demonstrable enthusiasm to actually spend money quickly or at all really on defense. Yes, it's easy to do. Yes, we'll set up a special team and we can make sure that whatever group is going to get a slice of the pie, you're going to be at the table. And then you run up against the exigencies of war. And a whole bunch of that went out of the window for Afghanistan. Now, the quantities we bought were not huge. The quality was very high and the speed was tremendous. The system sort of rebelled against that and has created more layers of bureaucracy to make sure that never happens again, which is an excuse for prime ministers to do nothing. If the prime minister wants it to happen, it'll happen. And creating good jobs for Canadians may be important, but it's not as important as getting the right kit in times of danger with the right troops, air, land, or sea, so they can fight and win the war or keep themselves alive. So for the Army, it's actually a lot easier in some ways and harder than others. So it's easier in the sense that the Army stuff is lots of smaller things, as you know. The quantities are quite large, and there's mischief which can cause havoc with supply chains and delivery, especially if you're not the same equipment as the big guy right next to you from whom you're used to getting just about everything else. So every time you go off and buy a Nicaraguan submarine, which doesn't exist, beware. You can maybe get away with it in the Navy in certain cases, but not in the Army because you're right next door or embedded in an American system. So there's that sort of logic to think through. Okay, let's get back to the issue here. We need stuff and we need it now. It's going to take the Navy 15 years to build submarines. Let's not be so stupid as to think that we can actually build the submarine hulls ourselves. Let's order those in and put some stuff in them. That'll still take 5 or 10 years. The Navy needs new warships built. And if the current system through the Irvings can only produce one per year, or it's every 3 to 4 years, well, you know what? That's not going to work because we need them kind of now. China's producing 2 ships a month. Now, they're really focused on this, and they have the world's biggest Navy, by the way, which I didn't know until quite recently. In the Army, We need a lot of stuff. We need it soon. And by the way, if you take 10 years not to produce something, it's not created any jobs. So the whole thing, if you got to get value for Canadians, that's a bunch of hoo-ha. So when the Minister of National Defense recently said on national TV, yeah, I know that we cut back on the ammunition, or some idiots immediately prior to me, he didn't use those are my words, cut back the 155 millimeter ammunition production from not bad to nothing. At a time when Ukraine desperately needs them and everyone could see that. Oh, and by the way, we need ourselves to train because we've got to train our troops to fight a war because they're going to Latvia. And 3 years have gone by, and the last time I checked, we still don't have those factories up and running. We used to have 3 of them, and 3 of them said they'll do it. They just want a longer-term contract so they can't be screwed around like they were screwed around last time by the bunch of idiots who canceled the contract. Why is it we haven't even produced artillery ammunition yet? 3 years the war's been raging. So what do? We send checks. Checks are great, but you actually need the stuff. And this current leadership team doesn't understand. I'm not talking about the people in uniform. I'm talking about the public servants or the politicians who actually control the outflow of money. The Army commander today, who's a great guy, he can't buy a crate of pencils. It's crazy. Talk about bureaucracy. So I'm not sure if I, in my rant, answered your question. Hopefully, if I misaligned myself, come on back to me if I missed anything.
No, that's great, sir. I appreciate it. It seems like we are hampered by a desire to, which I understand, the political imperative to try to create jobs. You know, use tax revenue to spin it back into our own economy, but it really does seem to hamstring us when it comes to military acquisition in a rapid and agile fashion. And yeah. I know other countries like Australia have carve-outs for defense procurement, so they don't have to spend everything inside their country. They're able to go abroad and get what they need. It'd be nice to see us get a bit of a carve-out for defense acquisition.
You know, people will tut and say, good heavens, you know, you're not being realistic. You don't understand the value for the taxpayer. Well, you know what? You know what's a really bad value for the taxpayers? If we don't have the capability when our nation needs it. And it's a really bad value for the taxpayer if the troops that we send into harm's way die when they might have lived if they'd had the equipment you idiots wouldn't give to him or her 5 years ago.
Yeah, yes, sir. Thank you. One final story, if I could. When you were the Army commander, I was a student on the Army operations course here in Kingston. You came to visit us, and I had to brief you on we were doing an attack into Fallujah, an urban attack, and I wasn't scarred by briefing you on it, but I was definitely petrified briefing the Army commander on our plan to attack. But anyways, I remember that to this day, almost 20 years ago. So thank you.
Hoorah. Well, thank you for your tolerance.
Sir, I think that sort of concludes it. The common thread running through here seems to be about political will.
Yeah.
You know, nothing gets done unless the Prime Minister wills it so. The sort of the question I have then, maybe as a takeaway, is there's 48 of us still in the call. What's your advice to us? What can we do to help our politicians find that political will?
Write an email to your member of parliament. Write an email to the Prime Minister's office. Just Google the address.
Mm-hmm.
Saying something like, your words, of course, I've just heard General Leslie talk about the current state of the Canadian forces. And here we are with bears and dragons looming on the horizon, and Canada's not ready. And you don't appear to be doing anything to make us any readier, if that's a word. Why the hell can't they spend the money they've been given when you own the procurement system? Why haven't you given the troops the equipment that they need, and they need it right now? Please explain. Something like that. That'll get their attention. 1 doesn't count. 20? 50? You get 1,000? Doesn't sound like a huge number nationally, but I'll tell you what, I've only sat in a politician's chair for 4 years. Glad I ran, glad I won, glad I left. one of the good things is I learned how some of them think. And I know how this gang think because I was their whip. By the way, it's been great. Thank you for your attention.
All right, Sarah, I think we'll wrap it up on that note. Thank you very much for your time. It's been an honor and privilege to listen. And I'm really glad you're still in there fighting and punching, because we need people who are articulate, we need people who are passionate, and we need people who know how to push the buttons.
Hoorah.
Karen, I'll pass it over to you for any final words.
Thank you, General Leslie. That was really riveting. And thank you to all of the participants tonight for an engaging discussion. We really rely on engagement in order to I think, keep these evenings engaging and interesting. So thank you for that. And please do join us in November. On November the 27th, we have Jim Cox talking about Canada's intelligence priorities. And that'll be at 1700 Mountain Standard Time. And January the 15th, we have Richard Martin, who's going to be talking about worldview warfare at 1600 Mountain Standard Time. So please keep in touch with us through our website, through the Rousey website. Sign up for our newsletters. Please take out memberships and stay with us and join us in the future. So thank you very much. Thanks again, General Leslie. Really appreciated your very, very interesting talk tonight.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.